chiefs on their EMS section. So I kind of crossed the chasm between intensive care and the field. I do a lot of writing now of reference books for nurses and physicians and intensive care people, paramedics, critical care folks, and have some background in both the field and the hospital, so that kind of lets me do a talk like I'm doing today. And I'll give you a quick synopsis. I handed out some cards to folks if I caught you when you were coming in that has my contact information on it. One thing I'll mention is that there's a website on there, which is my name. If you want this PowerPoint presentation, I gave it to VCOS as a PDF file, so it's on the VCOS website for the symposium. But if you want the actual PowerPoint slides, those are on my website, and you can go to my website. There's a little tab there called Open Bar, and a whole bunch of PowerPoints on there. You could download the actual PowerPoint. It's a pretty big file, so it wasn't possible to give it to VCOS as a PowerPoint. So that's the reason why I give you the cards, just so if you want that information, you can get them. And if you didn't get a card, I've left a stack of them on the table where you throw away your beer on the way out of the room, so you can grab them back there. Here's what I want to do this afternoon. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about why people die in fires, why civilians die, why firefighters die. Talk a little about the concept of survivability profiling and how that's changing, how it has changed, what it's all about, what some of the controversies are with that. You heard yesterday Dan and Steve talk about the whole school of fire dynamics, and what I'd like to do is take some of the things you heard yesterday morning, and if you've been listening to fire dynamics around the country as NIST and underwriters labs have been talking about it, we're going to take some of those concepts and put them into medicine and say how is it going to affect the survivability of people in a building when we're fighting a fire, and could our strategy and tactics do things to temperature and do things to oxygen level that would improve the survival of people who might be inside of a structure. And then I want to talk a little bit about PPE, specifically how our PPE prevents or causes us to get burned when we're in a fire, and what to do when you have a firefighter who potentially comes out with superheated gear or comes out on fire. What are some of the concepts that we should be keeping in mind to deal with that sort of situation? And then spend some time on burns themselves, talk a little bit about the difference between burns in civilians and burns in firefighters, and then smoke inhalation. And one of the points that I'll talk a little bit about is I want to show you how the United States ranks compared to other countries in survivability of people per capita when they're in a fire, because one of the surprising things is that we're one of the worst countries in the world to be a fire victim in. Your likelihood of living in the United States is second only to a couple other countries, and that's kind of distressing. So I think some of the concepts that you've heard yesterday and you've heard today and that I'm going to talk about will enlighten you to ways we could do things that might improve survivability of civilians. So the latest data that we have on fires shows a little over 1.2 million fires happened in 2013. We consistently have somewhere between 2,800 and 3,800 people die a year, civilians, in fires. Considerably less firefighters, and we're doing a good job keeping that number under 100. I think we still have a ways to go, but clearly firefighter deaths are on the decline from what they've been historically. A lot of people get injured, both civilians and firefighters, on the fire ground every year. And as I mentioned, if you compare us to other countries in the world, we're a full 30 to 50% higher in deaths per capita than most other countries. And that's a figure that really probably shouldn't be that way for the country that we are. I think the reason why some of us get hurt is stuff like this. I don't know how many more people you could get on that roof before it falls off the building, but clearly some of the things that we've been looking at with the 16 initiatives are safety issues. And safety issues not only hurt firefighters, but kill firefighters. So autopsy findings over the last few years have actually been repeated. 2012, they repeated autopsy findings that they first did in 1984. And it's interesting because it reveals a little bit about why people would die in a fire. When we pull somebody out of a structure, in 1984, half of those people had lethal levels of carbon monoxide in their bloodstream. A lot of them had soot in their respiratory tract, which means they were alive, taking breaths while they were unconscious in a fire. A significant number of them were drunk, which we know has a lot to do with people who get hurt or die in fires. And interestingly, burns were very minor in the importance of what killed people. So you summarize all those autopsy findings of 169 patients in 1984, and you come up with two things that were the leading causes of death: carbon monoxide and other things that people inhaled, and oxygen deficiency. You notice that burns isn't even on there. And when you look at a lot of our deaths that we see in fires, burns are not the cause of death. Most of the time it'll say the coroner said he died of smoke inhalation. And you know as well as I do that when you pull people out of a fire, it's pretty rare that they're a crispy critter. Most of the time it's somebody who had some kind of inhalation injury. So flash forward to 2012, some 20-some years later, and do that same study again. Now we have 285 people, significant amount of carbon monoxide in their bloodstream, a lot more than we saw back in 1984, and cyanide is now prevalent in a lot of the people who we're looking at autopsies of 20-some years later. Significantly more of them are drunk, which probably a facet of our society. And again, burns are not a significant contributor to their death. Summarize all of the causes of death a couple of years ago, and we come up with not only carbon monoxide, but cyanide poisoning, and again, oxygen deficiency. So not a lot has changed in 20-some years, except that we're adding in new poisons that people are inhaling that tend to be killing them. So you look at causes of firefighter deaths, and this is a study from the U.S. Fire Administration looking at a 10-year period of time of what kills firefighters. You see on this list that obviously cardiac arrest and stroke and heart attack is the leading cause of death, but burns pretty low. Less than 4% of firefighters die from burns. And in 2012, when you look at all causes of death of firefighters who died that year, there were no causes of death from burns that year. So it's pretty rare that a firefighter actually burns to death. Interestingly, that kind of led, this whole thought process led to survivability profiling. So if you remember, it was about 8 or 9 years ago, an EFO paper, one of the executive fire officer papers that came out of New York City, looked at the concept of, could somebody in the structure that we're pulling up on a job at be alive? Could they survive the conditions that we're seeing? And the suggestion was that if you could determine whether civilians would survive or not, you could make better decisions about committing to going into that structure and maybe make things safer for firefighters. So the concept, though, was not wholly embraced wholeheartedly by the fire service, because people thought, well, there's so many variables to this that it may keep firefighters safer, but I'm not so sure that we're not going to lose some civilians that we might potentially be able to save. And it was premised on some things that have really changed since the time that this paper was written. One of the premises was NFPA had propagated a theory that there is no person alive that could survive in a temperature that exceeded boiling water. And as soon as you were in an environment that was more than 212 degrees Fahrenheit, you'd be dead. Since then, we've looked at patients in burn centers and found that a number of our patients survive and do relatively well, get discharged without any adverse consequences in temperatures that exceed 350 degrees, and some even more recently 400 degrees. And so there's some physiologic phenomena that explains that, but that kind of changes our thought process because it's kind of uncommon for temperatures to exceed those values. So interestingly, that science has kind of changed a little bit since this concept was introduced. The other thing that we've learned is that it's not just carbon monoxide, but it's probably cyanide that causes people to die. And I'll come back to that concept in a little bit. And oxygen deficiency is really an issue, but do we know exactly what the levels of oxygen are that are survivable or not? We do. We don't pay attention to it a lot, so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that specifically. Big things that we don't know when we pull up at a fire are, how long has that fire been burning? We oftentimes have no clue where the fire is. That's why we're doing all these 360s and trying to figure out specifically what it is that we're trying to attack. It would be nice if all the buildings that we pulled up at had little gauges on them, like Dan Zabrowski's buildings that he burns, where you can just look at the wall and say, oh, the temperature inside is this, these are the gases that are in the air, but that's not on the structures that we pull up on. And then we really don't know what are the ages and the general health of the people that we're responding to. So how well would those people do? And we know from looking at those autopsy studies that if you're in that 15 to 35 age range that your likelihood of getting out of a burning building is 3-4 times better than somebody who's really old or somebody who's really young. So those are things that we don't really know. That, however, has sort of led us to think a little bit more about fire dynamics. And fire dynamics is kind of today's fire science. You heard about it yesterday morning when the guys from NIST and the Sprinkler Coalition talked a little bit about the whole concept of fire dynamics and how fires start and how they develop. And it's really not new information. There's some folks in here that look like they're old enough to have read some of the early textbooks on fire essentials when they had the textbooks that were labeled fire essentials. And that had a lot of information in it about chemistry. It had a lot of information about fire dynamics. And over the years, we had so many technical things evolve in the fire service that they had to pull something out of the textbooks, and that material kind of got put by the wayside and put all kinds of new information in about hoses and hydrants and couplings and replaced a lot of that data. Well, we're going back to that data now, and we're talking about changing the mnemonic that company officers use when they arrive at a fire and saying, instead of the old rescue, exposures, confinement, extinguishment, overhaul, thinking about really what's the goal. The goal is to get some water on the fire as fast as possible so that the fire will go out. And interestingly, that's led to this slicers thing that you saw yesterday. And when I talk to EMS groups and we look at the beginning of the slicers algorithm, where basically you don't see anything on there that says rescue. And in fact, when you delve down into what they're getting at with this,